This is Anne. At 33 years old, Anne was a rising star in the aviation world, a first officer with big dreams. Her journey into the skies had started in a very different place, as a flight attendant at Republic Airlines. But she eventually pursued her dream of becoming a professional pilot. By February 2015, Anne had earned her private pilot certificate, followed quickly by her instrument rating in the same year. However, the road to her first commercial flight was rocky. After a failed check ride for her commercial rating due to performance issues in critical maneuvers, she passed just 9 days later, a sign of her perseverance. By November 2016, Anne had accumulated 650 flight hours and secured a job with Air Cargo Carriers, ACC, flying the 1979 Scudrunning Super 330 aircraft. This aircraft, though originally designed as a small passenger turboprop, had been converted into a cargo plane in 1998. It was not the easiest plane to operate, and Anne was about to learn the hard way that the aircraft's complexity was only the beginning of her challenges. While Anne was an enthusiastic, yet relatively inexperienced pilot, the man in charge of this flight, her captain Jonathan, was a different story. At 47, Jonathan had been flying for many years. His background, however, was riddled with unsettling history. According to NTSB records, Jonathan had failed several key check rides with issues in takeoffs, landings, go-arounds, navigation, and emergency procedures. Despite this, he continued to pass his evaluations, albeit often with failures lingering in his record. Most notably, Jonathan had even been fired from a previous employer for negligence involving a hangar door. He later told ACC management that he had never failed a check ride and had left previous employers due to slow performance in training exercises, a red flag that the company failed to investigate thoroughly. This brings us to the crash that cost Anne her life. While Anne's flight experience was growing, Jonathan's history was far from stellar, but the company never delved into his past. This oversight would have catastrophic consequences. On the fateful day of the crash, Jonathan was in command of the aircraft while Anne was in the right seat. The Super 330, a small but capable aircraft, was designed to carry cargo, but it also carried risks, especially for inexperienced pilots and those with questionable backgrounds at the helm. ACC's unique policy of pairing captains with first officers meant that Anne had no choice but to fly with Jonathan consistently. There were no other captains available, and Anne, trusting the system, had no reason to question her training or the captain she flew with. Unfortunately, this decision would prove fatal. But what really went wrong on that day? This was not a simple case of a rookie pilot making a critical error. The aircraft crashed violently, its left wing ripped off as it slammed into the runway, and then veered off course, ultimately crashing into the woods. But Anne wasn't at the controls when it happened. In fact, Anne was not flying the plane during the final moments. It was Jonathan who was in command when the disaster struck, and his decisions would be scrutinized in the aftermath. As the NTSB began its investigation, they found that the failure to conduct a proper go-around a maneuver that can be life-saving when faced with unstable flight conditions was a key factor. Jonathan's failure to execute this procedure was echoed in his previous check rides, where he failed to respond properly during critical landing procedures. In fact, his repeated failures to handle go-arounds, as well as his poor response to glide slope and localizer warnings during an ILS approach, painted a disturbing picture. This wasn't just an isolated mistake. It was a pattern of inadequacy, one that would ultimately lead to a preventable tragedy. At the time of the crash, Jonathan had accumulated over 4,300 total hours, but with more than 1,000 of those hours in the Super 330. Even though his flight hours were extensive, they did not make up for his consistent failure to demonstrate mastery of fundamental flight skills. His earlier failures should have prompted a closer look at his qualifications before he was placed in such a critical role. When comparing this case to others in the history of aviation, there are similarities with other accidents where a pilot's poor performance history was overlooked ultimately leading to tragedy. In 2009, for example, the crash of Air France Flight 447 was attributed in part to poor decision-making by the pilots, despite the crew's extensive training and hours. Similar to Jonathan, the Air France pilots were found to have ignored critical stall warnings and failed to initiate the necessary recovery procedures. In both cases, failure to act promptly and decisively in the face of warning signs led to disaster. In Anne's case, the combination of Jonathan's insufficient skills, the company's lack of due diligence in vetting their pilots' histories, and the poor communication between crew members led to a fatal error in judgment. Jonathan's decisions, compounded by his inability to properly handle the aircraft during crucial moments, set the stage for the tragic end to Anne's first flying job. In aviation, pilot error is one of the leading causes of crashes. But what makes this case even more tragic is that it wasn't just the error of a single person. It was a systemic failure, starting with the company's hiring practices and ending with a series of poor decisions in the cockpit. Understanding the technical failures, like the inability to perform a go-around or to address glide slope warnings, gives us crucial insights into what went wrong. It wasn't a simple mistake. It was a fatal sequence of events that began long before Anne's final flight. Stay with us as we dive deeper into the flight's final moments, analyze the key technical elements that led to the crash, and draw comparisons to similar aviation accidents that highlight the lessons we must learn to ensure that tragedies like this don't happen again. Let me just say, permanent crew pairings in aviation are a terrible idea, especially when you're forcing two pilots who've never flown together into a situation where they're stuck with each other, regardless of whether they're a good match. In my experience, the only time permanent pairings work is in combat scenarios, where conditions are extreme and the stakes are high, like when I was flying the F-15E. But that's an exception, not the norm, and it's certainly not something that should be applied to civilian aviation. One of the biggest problems with permanent pairings is something known as procedural drift. This phenomenon happens when over time pilots start cutting corners or changing their procedures without even realizing it. It can start small, skipping items on the checklist, for instance, but eventually it compromises safety. In Anne's case, this drift was more than just skipping a few checklist items. It was a complete breakdown in communication and decision-making in the cockpit. And unfortunately, Anne was flying with a captain who had a pattern of behavior that should have been flagged much earlier. The company she worked for, Air Cargo Carriers ACC, didn't have a formal safety reporting system or a solid method for assessing pilots with troubling histories. Instead, pilots were expected to take the initiative and call or email the director of training or the chief pilot about any safety concerns, a practice that isn't exactly conducive to speaking up, especially for someone as new to the profession as Anne. But perhaps the most shocking failure was the lack of an initial operating experience. IOE program for new pilots. IOE is a crucial part of any airline's training protocol. It involves flying with a more experienced pilot, typically a line check airman, during the first few weeks or months after a new pilot gets their type rating. This is where they bridge the gap between simulator training and real-world flying, ensuring that they can apply everything they've learned in a controlled environment to the unpredictable nature of live operations. Unfortunately, at ACC, they didn't have this program in place. They did a check-in after a week, but, as Anne's case tragically shows, that was far from sufficient. Anne left to figure things out on her own, found herself paired with Jonathan, a captain whose behavior was becoming increasingly problematic. She had no one else to compare him to, no formal feedback system to address her growing concerns, and no outlet to voice the growing anxiety she felt. It didn't take long before Anne started noticing red flags. Just 2 weeks into flying with Jonathan, she texted a friend saying, "Just had the biggest scare of my life, thought I was going to die." She went on to describe how after takeoff, the nose gear lights stayed on, indicating that the nose gear was still down. Jonathan, eager to get out of the weather, decided to make steep turns at up to 60 degrees of bank, and descend with the plan to leave the gear down and land at the airport they had just taken off from. The maneuver was dangerous, and Anne was terrified they would crash into the mountains. They ended up breaking through the clouds, but in doing so, they found themselves dangerously off course and not aligned with the correct runway. Now imagine the technical implications of what happened. Jonathan's decision to continue with steep turns and descending flight, combined with his poor handling of the aircraft's gear malfunction, was a serious breach of standard operating procedures. Steep turns during an emergency gear situation are considered risky, especially without proper training or experience, and Jonathan's decision-making failed to prioritize safety. Had they been in a more advanced aircraft with better autopilot systems, the risk of an accident could have been significantly reduced. But for Anne, this was her first job, and she was caught between trusting her more experienced captain and the instinctual knowledge that something wasn't right. The fact that Anne knew deep down that they were taking an unnecessarily dangerous route, flying visual in the clouds, trying to break through weather, and disregarding safety procedures like requesting vectors for a controlled approach, makes the tragedy even more heartbreaking. She understood the risk, but as a new pilot, she didn't feel empowered enough to push back against Jonathan, who had 15 more years of experience. This reluctance to question a captain's decisions is an unfortunate reality in aviation, especially for new pilots, and it's compounded when you're working in an environment with no formal safety checks or feedback mechanisms. The most gut-wrenching part of this whole ordeal is how Anne rationalized her fears to herself. She said, "I feel like we should have asked a TC for vectors to do an approach, instead of flying visual in the clouds, trying to find a way to get below the weather, especially with all the hills around the airport." She was absolutely right, but she was too inexperienced to push the issue, and the company's lack of oversight allowed this unsafe behavior to continue. The warning signs didn't stop there. Just 2 weeks later, Anne texted her friend, saying, "Captain is sleeping. I'm going to need you to keep me entertained for the rest of the flight." She went on to explain how she was flying the plane while Jonathan slept, adding, "Can you imagine if this plane had an autopilot? We'd both be asleep." This wasn't just a one-time issue. Over the next month, Anne's frustration grew. She complained that Jonathan was lazy, blaming his depression over a breakup, and took advantage of her inexperience. He asked her to fly the plane while he slept during flights. In aviation, there's a principle known as pilot fatigue, and it's one of the most serious risks in the cockpit. Pilots are trained to manage their workload and communicate if they're feeling tired. But what happens when a captain is sleeping on the job and a first officer is left to carry the weight of the flight? Anne was put in an impossible position. She was dealing with a captain who had a history of poor decision-making, who was now engaging in reckless behavior due to his personal issues. Meanwhile, Anne was left to manage the plane, flying it alone sometimes, while her captain slept. This is where the lack of proper systems and training failed her. Fatigue management and crew resource management (CRM) are essential parts of a pilot's training, and the fact that Anne was not only flying alone but doing so while Jonathan slept is an illustration of just how much things had drifted in the cockpit. The system that was supposed to ensure safe flight operations was broken, and Anne's life would ultimately pay the price. When we look at the broader implications of this tragedy, it's clear that procedural drift and the lack of a feedback loop played a significant role in the events leading up to Anne's death. Had there been a formal oversight program or a system that allowed new pilots to raise concerns without fear of retribution, Anne might have been able to voice her concerns before it was too late. Moreover, had Jonathan been held accountable for his past failures, this tragedy might have been prevented. In aviation, every flight is a team effort, and every decision made in the cockpit has a direct impact on safety. It's critical that pilots are given the proper tool support and oversight to prevent accidents like the one that took Anne's life. Unfortunately, in this case, the system failed her at every turn, and the result was a catastrophic tragedy. As the days passed, Anne became increasingly uncomfortable with Jonathan's behavior, and though she voiced her concerns to him directly, she never took them to the chief pilot or reported the issues to the company. This silence would become a significant part of the tragedy that followed. One crucial aspect I haven't mentioned yet is the nature of the flights they were operating. Most of their routes involved overnight flying from 11 p.m. to 8 a.m. These late-night long-duration flights can be incredibly fatiguing, and fatigue, as we know, is a killer in aviation. It's important to understand that hand flying at night in weather is one of the most challenging tasks a pilot can face. The strain on a pilot's mental and physical faculties is immense, especially when navigating poor visibility and changing conditions. What makes this even more unforgivable is that Jonathan, the captain, was often napping during the flight, leaving Anne to handle the plane on her own. This is not only unprofessional, but reckless, as it compromises the entire crew's ability to operate safely in challenging environments. Around 5 weeks before the crash on March 31st, Anne sent a text to a friend revealing more troubling details about their flying. She explained that they were forced to do the entire flight at 4,000 feet to stay below the weather, a practice known as Scudrunning. Jonathan, it seemed, wasn't comfortable flying in instrument meteorological conditions, IMC, and preferred visual flight rules, VFR, flying a method that is far more risky, especially when you're pushing the limits of the weather and visibility. This was further compounded by his poor instrument flight rules, IFR skills. Despite the growing concerns, Anne continued flying with Jonathan. On May 17th, they took off from Louisville at 5:40 a.m. heading back to Charleston. The flight initially went smoothly, with the plane climbing to an altitude of 9,000 feet. But as they neared Charleston, things began to unravel. The weather at the airport was reported to be winds from 80 degrees at 11 knots with 10 miles of visibility, which seemed manageable. However, the conditions had actually worsened, and this was where the confusion started. About 7 minutes earlier, an updated special weather observation had been issued, revealing overcast clouds at just 500 feet and fog in the valley around the airport. This change was critical, but the ADIS Airport Data Information System that Jonathan and Anne checked didn't reflect this updated information. The controller later told investigators that he didn't update the ADIS because it was a judgment call, and he expected the weather to improve shortly. This, of course, was a failure of the system. What followed was another blunder. When Jonathan and Anne checked in with the controller did not provide the updated weather information. Instead, he gave them a clearance for a localizer approach to runway 5. This instrument approach has a minimum descent altitude of 1,320 feet, which is about 373 feet above the ground. Reasonable for conditions, but the actual cloud ceiling was now only 500 feet, which meant they were already below the required minimums. They also had the option of flying the VWAR Alpha approach, a circling approach with a much higher minimum descent altitude of 1,600 feet. A circling approach is far more risky, particularly in marginal weather, and the procedure states that it should only be used when a straight-in approach is not available. This was not the case. The localizer approach was the safest option, but for some reason, Jonathan and Anne requested the VOR circling approach, and the controller cleared them for it. At this point, they had only 5 minutes left to live. This is where we see procedural drift in action. The decision to fly a circling approach instead of the safer straight-in localizer approach is a textbook example of procedural drift. The company's standard operating procedures, SOPs, clearly stated that circling approaches should only be flown when no straight-in approach is available. In this case, it was available, but Jonathan and Anne ignored it. Over time, both pilots had become complacent and forgotten why the localizer approach was safer, particularly in conditions like this. Radar data shows that about 4 minutes before the crash, the plane was at 200 feet and 11 miles from the runway. The tower issued a low-altitude alert, warning them that they were descending too quickly. Their response was to say they were going down to 1,600 feet, which didn't make sense, as this was the minimum descent altitude, and they were still too far out to be that low. They continued descending at a rate of between 1,300 to 2,000 feet per minute, which is far too steep for this phase of flight. By the time they were 4 miles from the runway, Jonathan leveled off at 1,600 feet, likely trying to scud run, flying visually, just below the clouds in an attempt to reach the airport. This maneuver was incredibly dangerous. 2 minutes later, they were just half a mile from the runway, and they started descending at a rate of 2,500 feet per minute, which is dangerously fast. Jonathan, possibly seeing the runway at the last moment, made a desperate attempt to reach it, even though it was far too late to safely land. As they crossed the runway centerline, they entered a steep left bank reaching 42 degrees. Jonathan tried to recover, but the damage had already been done. The aircraft's left wingtip hit the ground, first tearing the wing off, and the plane broke apart, sliding across the grass and into the woods. Finally, coming to a stop, Jonathan and Anne were killed instantly. When investigators reviewed the historical radar data, they discovered that Jonathan had descended below the minimum descent altitude on 3 previous occasions when flying the VOR approach into Charleston. This was a clear indication of a systemic failure in his flying habits, and it should have raised red flags long before the fatal flight. The NTSB's investigation concluded that the probable cause of the crash was the flight crew's decision to fly a circling approach instead of the safer straight-in approach, and Jonathan's excessive descent rate and maneuvering in poor weather. However, I believe the true mistake, the one that led to Anne's death, was Jonathan's utter disregard for safety procedures, combined with the company's lack of oversight and the failure to implement proper safety protocols. Anne could have prevented the tragedy if she had spoken up about her concerns to the chief pilot. But that doesn't mean she was responsible for the crash. Anne didn't deserve to die like this. She was let down by a system that failed to protect her. This tragic event is filled with lessons about the dangers of procedural drift fatigue management and the importance of safety reporting systems. Had the company done more to ensure its pilots were following the correct procedures, and had Anne been given the support she needed to speak up, this disaster might have been prevented. I hope this debrief serves as a valuable lesson for pilots and aviation professionals everywhere. Stay vigilant. Follow procedures and never underestimate the importance of a safety culture that allows pilots to speak up when things aren't right. Thank you for your support.